Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I have a couple of housekeeping announcements before we actually start the session. My name is John Gershman. I'm from the Wagner School at New York University. And just to make sure that everyone's in the right place, this is the Demanding Prosperity for People and Planet session. But before we start, a couple of announcements. First of all, we're going to continue pushing back each session by a half an hour to accommodate kind of where we are now. So that includes lunch and then the panel sessions after lunch. But the award session is going to start as scheduled, as in the original schedule. So it'll only be postponing and moving back the next two sessions. Secondly, the Skoll Foundation has identified a new fundraising strategy, which is anyone's cell phone that goes off in the panel will be confiscated, and then you can ransom it back at the end of the session. So if you could silence all of your cell phones, pagers, and other kinds of things, that would be great. We're also asking people to feel free to use the social media sites throughout the session, and that the Twitter hashtag is #SkollWF. People are invited to continue networking conversations in the Cisco CoLab in rooms 12 and 13 here at the Side Business School. And just to give a sense of the parameters of how we're going to run the session this morning, we're going to have a facilitated conversation among the panelists for 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then we're going to open it up to questions and discussion and engagement with all of you. So briefly, everyone's bio is in here. I'm not going to go into gory detail in terms of introducing our esteemed panelists, and we're going to just kind of kick off the conversation and just ask people to give a short introduction of how they themselves, what kind of perspective do each of the panelists bring to this question of thinking about balancing prosperity for people and the planet. How do we actually think about trying to achieve simultaneously human development outcomes and sustainable use of resources in a resource-constrained world? And so why don't we start with Vinod, and then we'll work our way down the panel.
Thank you very much, John. I wanted to appreciate this great opportunity to exchange ideas with this group. Just very briefly, I'm currently heading the independent evaluation of the Asian Development Bank's work in Asia, broadly defined to include Central Asia. I did the same at the World Bank for 5 or 6 years before that, and it essentially involves looking at the projects and also the policies that are supported to see whether they make a difference at the end of the day, precisely for the well-being of people and the well-being of the planet. The first part has gotten more and more attention. The second part has not. So there is a big gap right up front on those 2 points. But I'll be happy to come back as we go.
I had one in Africa, and I think the big sort of perspective that we bring to all of this, to the issue of sustainability and prosperity, is that of transparency and accountability. That's really for us what I would call a low-hanging fruit, because it is really the only way to ensure that development is broad-based and that it really impacts the poor. So for us, that's really a big thing. It's about accountable and responsible development. It's about citizens being able to hold their leaders to account. And I have to say that's the only reason we're interested in transparency and accountability, is because ultimately that's what will deliver, health, education, infrastructure, and lead to sustainable poverty reduction. So, and then in terms of, perspective also, I mean, I don't think this is a unique perspective, but I certainly bring the perspective which is, looking at things through the African lens. And I think that's important, beginning to engage more Africans in terms of what they want, or what Africa wants, or what Africa needs, and engaging them more in these discussions. And so we're looking at transparency and accountability from all perspectives, budget transparency, so that citizens know what their governments are spending and how they're spending it. We're looking at aid transparency, so that African leaders are not just accountable to the donors, more importantly, they're accountable to their citizens. We're looking at, so transparency and accountability at every level, particularly in extractives, in the extractive sector. The cruel irony about Africa is that it is the poorest region in the world and the only region where poverty is actually, the number of people living in poverty is growing. And yet, it is the country with the most resources, natural resources, which tells you something about the vast potential for Africa to lift its own people out of poverty. So that's why we say, transparency and accountability is a really low-hanging fruit. It is the way to go forward and take people out of poverty. So.
Yeah, my name is Joe Madiyat. I work with an organization called Gram Vikas. Gram means village, Vikas means development. It is working in the eastern part of India, mainly in a state called Orissa. Yeah, I'm working towards the prosperity of the marginalized. I have not yet reached the planet yet. And when we work with the marginalized people, with the ultra poor, there are no low-hanging fruits. All the fruits that you have to pluck are right up there in the tree. It is almost made impossible for these people to climb that tree, and then if you ultimately climb that tree, there are very few fruits left there. So that is the situation from where I come, and I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that Christine hunted me down and brought me here.
Well, good morning. My name's Camilla Tallman. I'm the director of a policy think tank based in London but working globally. We were asked before we came on to think about where our blind spot has been in relation to the topic under question. And I'm really pleased to hear from the other panelists this focus, which I would also have, on the need to understand politics and interests, the role of transparency and accountability in terms of uncovering politics and interests as being at the heart of explaining why we're not making more progress in delivering prosperity for people and the planet. I don't know how many of you have been watching the UK news over the last few days, but there's been a bit of a stooshy, a kerfuffle noise around the fact that if you're rich and you pay £250,000, you can have dinner with the Prime Minister and feed him your ideas about what he should be doing, particularly things like bringing down the top rate of tax. That sort of transparency is essential, but it took some uncovering to find out this was going on. That sort of transparency is essential if countries in Africa are going to be able to use their mineral wealth to benefit the many rather than the few. That kind of transparency is essential if we're going to make progress on delivering a global agreement on climate change. So I'm happy to find myself so much at one with people on the panel. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to argue about, but we'll have a go.
Well, we'll see if we can find some things. Maybe we could start kind of continuing the conversation by talking about in concrete terms, because we can talk in broader analytical terms about transparency, accountability. Could each of you kind of identify a particular project or program that you think in some way embodies the kind of principles that we're talking about here, that would reflect a positive example of an effort to actually address this nexus of people in the planet? And maybe, Sifo, we could start with you.
An example that I can think of, I mentioned in my introduction our work in extractives transparency. That's a really big deal for us because that's where the resources really lie. And one of the things that we've done at a year and a half ago, we managed to get the Card-and-Luga legislation passed, which essentially forces companies that are registered on the New York Stock Exchange to publish what they pay. And right now, we're actually fighting with the EU and the SEC regulators, the Securities and Exchange Commission regulators, to make sure that this really makes it into the law books of the EU. But also, we're dealing with big oil lobby companies that are trying to really stifle this and make sure that it doesn't see the light of day, because they have vested interest in making sure that it doesn't see the light of day. So for us, this is a really important program. We have right now actually a campaign that's going on where we're seeking 90,000 signatures. We're seeking 100,000 signatures and we have 90,000. So maybe with the help of everyone here, we can get the extra 10,000 signatures. And essentially what we're asking is for the oil, gas, and extractive companies and mineral companies to publish what they pay and begin to really follow the rules in terms of transparency. Because once we get that sorted, then the companies in Africa or the governments in Africa that they work with really will have nowhere to hide. So I think that's a really great example. Another example I can give is we're working on an agriculture campaign right now. And recently we delivered the first ever petition on African soil to President Kikwete of Tanzania, asking African leaders to keep their promises, which is to commit 10% of their budgets to agriculture development and to agriculture and rural development. And part of that ask is not only about making sure that the budget allocations benefit smallholder farmers, but being transparent in how they go about it so that citizens have access to the budget and know exactly how the budget is utilized and then can hold their leaders to account. And it takes us back also, to the discussion about accountability and African governments being accountable more to the donors than to the citizens. And what we're saying is the most important accountability relationship is between the government and their citizens. So we want transparent aid, we want transparent budgets, we want transparent resources, and really just transparency across the board.
That's great. Joe?
I was struck by Gordon Brown's clarion call for education, educating those people who have been unreached. But I think one aspect of education was not at least voiced there. For education to become a reality, say in South Asian countries, and especially in India, there has to be an enabling environment. If a woman has to carry water for 6 hours to meet the domestic needs, the drinking and other domestic water needs of a family, and when in India, carrying of water is gender designated, so which means only women and girls will carry. So even if this woman has got a child of 6 or 7 years, she will take that girl child along with her to fetch even 5 liters of water so that her drudgery reduces. So this is what I call, unless you can reduce that sort of a drudgery, which is today in the 21st century unnecessary, you can't get, whatever be the number of schools that there are there and other facilities or even a teacher, you can't get girls in these areas where they have to work for 3 to 6 hours every day just to bring the water that is needed for the house. Another thing about I wanted to say, because I think education is the ultimate tool. Unless we can reach education, their own development is not going to come. But what prevents education from reaching it? Like in India, in my state, Orissa, the cake, the job cake is already defined. It is very limited. It cannot be expanded too much. Those who get a superior education today have access to that job. So there is a collusion among those who are privy to that sort of a facility to get that educated, to see that the others remain where they are. And we speak about non-formal education, informal education, whereas this minority get a better education. So again, and hence, because if only the minority get that education, the jobs are theirs, the privileges are there, they govern, they are the technicians, they are the bureaucrats, they are the politicians. The power is kept among themselves. It is not allowed to go. So there is a connivance which has to be questioned, which has to be challenged. And it is not, you are not going to find many supporters of that, because it sacrifices their own privileges. So I think when we look at the well-being of people, especially say this 30% of Indian people, or 30% of people in South Asia, and maybe even Africa, I do not know much about Africa, we will have to address a problem, the problem of underdevelopment, of what is good for them. And I think if it is good for the marginalized, the people who are excluded today, it would be good for the planet, and we can take that forward.
Great.
Yes, thinking about transparency and accountability, two short points. One, really building on what Sifo was talking about, the foreign investment coming in for extractive industries. You've been looking very much at the government to the company and how you can use US and EU legislation to open up the payment process. I guess what we've been doing is working downwards from the government in a number of countries and saying, how can you support oversight by parliament, by citizen groups, by farmer associations to demand of government that these investment contracts be negotiated openly and with scrutiny from peoples whose real interests are concerned. I think we've all watched with horror a lot of the press comment about land grabs and huge areas of land being negotiated away from under the feet of farmers who've often been using that land for generations. Governments need to feel heat and pressure from their populations that they can't do that, and that they need to find a common benefit for their citizens as well as for people in government if that sort of investment contract is going to go forward. The second area of transparency and accountability, I think, which it'd be good to talk about a bit, is how do we make sure that the metrics that we use for judging growth, prosperity, income, and so on, how do we make sure that those metrics actually convey what it is that we think is good and what we think is bad? Take things like food. The price of food does not really represent the costs and benefits associated with producing it. When you buy a pair of jeans for $3, that price is much too low if you think about the social and environmental costs often involved in generating that pair of jeans. We've got to find a way of better pricing in the goods and bads, particularly the fossil fuels, but also some of the other environmental and social variables, which mean that prices properly signal the value of goods and services.
That's great. Well, Vinod, I know that you've done a lot of thinking about metrics and how do we actually construct metrics that help us think through the impacts of projects and programs and initiatives we might have. So maybe you could take off from Camilla's point there and talk a little bit about that.
Thanks. I think Camilla's last point opens up a whole discussion of the valuation that in the end underpins a lot of the specific things we do. So we can get a few things right at the project level, but if the policies value things in a very distorted way, that's a big elephant in the room. That just overwhelms all the good stuff we do at this micro level. So both are essential. If you only did the micro, I think you've missed the big picture. If you only did the big, the follow-up is still not going to be meaningful. But if I may just stay back for a minute on the first part of the huge issue on governance transparency, I think there are a few good examples, but they just are not scaled up enough of announcing, for instance, a citizen scorecard and announcing publicly who has gotten what. And those efforts, one example in Uganda where this was posted and announced, impact evaluation finds that did make a big difference down the road. These examples are not scaled up, and we have to ask, why don't we do that just across the board on a bigger scale? There are many other so-called win-wins, like energy subsidies are $450 billion. If they were reduced, you would think the economy gains, the environment gains, and everything seems to be a win-win. They don't get followed up. So that has to be the biggest puzzle. If national economies and the globe and the planet gain, what is the problem? Well, it's not win-win-win. It's really win-win and lose for some strong interest. That's the catch. So can't we go much more vigorously after that when they are more of the low-hanging fruits and they are win-win propositions? Aside from energy efficiency, there are many things. The IMF released a report that showed that the economic crisis could have been predicted much more clearly by 1,000 PhDs in economics within the walls of the IMF, because internal memos were there. It would have been a win-win, right? But why did that not get out? So again, like the vested interest, there's a small group of people who feel that rocking the boat has some problems, and you can't do that. So those are the groupthink side of the vested interest. So there are 2 or 3 big picture things, and at a conference like Skoll, my mind goes to what does it take to take those on where it's not debatable that it's a win-win for society, but it is not happening because a minority, either intellectually or financially, is blocking the way. Well, go to town and break that, however, whatever it takes. So that was my thought on the first part. But just coming back and maybe just to leave a thought on the table, the whole question of evaluating and having a matrix that values natural resources has to be the biggest market failure of our times, because the genes example, and you can go down the list of even more obvious ones where you have economic growth models. Physical capital has been valued, the financial and physical capital. Social and human capital were not valued for a while, but they are getting more attention. That's what I meant in my opening remarks, that we also want to recognize where there has been some progress. Not nearly as well, but there has been more of an incorporation of the fact that if you invested in people, it's good for themselves, but it is also good for society because it will generate even conventionally measured growth. Natural capital not only has not been valued, but enters perversely, which means that if you run it down, your GDP grows up. So you have a bigger problem than ever. Now, that valuation, that's a big picture valuation issue, translates into very specific things like the genes example, but even more obvious ones than the genes of polluting the air. And the contribution of the company goes up in terms of the balance sheet. Again, good examples, some very good examples. I think Interface is one where a company seems to have brought together the cost, the carbon footprint of making carpets. Puma is mentioned. There are many, many good examples, but they pale in terms of the big picture on natural resource valuation. So I come back to this later in terms of specifics. What are the 5 things we can do at the micro and macro level to value things better? Announce it. If people see that and they support it, then you get support for pursuing those technical details. If people don't see it, you can do all the technical work, it still will not win votes, and so we have a problem.
So the issue about that this is an issue fundamentally of power, and that transparency can be a necessary but not sufficient condition for trying to confront that. Joe, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically about Graham Vickas's work and how you try to link the issue of both trying to address the needs of women and girls not having to spend 6 hours a day gathering water for household needs, but then also attacking the enabling or disabling environments in which your projects and organizations actually work.
Yeah. One thing is the time that is spent in carrying water. The other is that you free girls to go to school. You feel, and you even free boys, because they would often be, when the girl child is going to get water, the boy child is looking after the siblings. So nobody goes to school, and you perpetuate the system. There's still another factor when you look at it. The factor is that in most rural areas, at least all throughout India, 80% of all diseases are because of poor quality water. Waterborne diseases account for 80% of, or more than 80% of the diseases. And that is diarrhea, dysentery, gastroenteritis, typhoid, cholera. And this affects the poor even more, because if the person or the people cannot, because they are sick, they cannot go to work, they have no food to eat. If they have no food to eat, they become weaker. And ultimately, to get out of that situation, they borrow money and go into a debt loop. And Asian Development Bank doesn't get them out. So, nor do our governments get them out. So what do? They go from one poor situation to a worse situation. We thought that if we could in some way find an answer to this particular problem, it would in a very big way change the whole scenario in villages. So we have gone. Another problem that is especially true of India is the exclusion problem. People are excluded on caste basis. So you are born an untouchable, though it is no longer legal to practice that untouchability, but you can't take it away from the minds of people. So untouchables still continue to a great extent untouchable. So the untouchables cannot drink from the same source of water as the caste people. So we thought that if good quality water could be given, then 80% of the diseases are eliminated. People would have better health. They would earn more. So what we have done is, in Orissa, where we started, any village that could come together, but on a 100% basis, no distinction among the caste or class of people, and they would put an amount of 1,000 rupees on an average, the poor giving less, but the better off giving more, but the ultimate amount would be 1,000 rupees on an average, which is about $20 today. $20 is a small sum, but 1,000 rupees is like $1,000 for these people. That would be put into an endowment, invested in a bank, and people would build their own toilets and a shower with the help from government, and 24 hours portable water supply to every village and there would be a meter for each family and they would pay volumetrically for the water they consumed. And each family has to have this toilet. There cannot be one exception. If there is one exception, we don't work in that village, and it has to be the same water source. The endowment that was put together, the interest from that will finance future families when families become bigger and they build another hut for the son who got married. And because there is a subsidy portion for the external material, cement, steel, the commode, etc., which comes from the government and other donor agencies. But at that time, when there would be nobody to fund that, the interest from the endowment will fund that particular aspect, and it will be forever on 100%. Well, it is a complex program, but people have done it now in 1,250 villages. All are functioning. The poorest people are paying for the water they use, and the government of Orissa has been very kind to us, because they are even the electricity, if at all we have to pump, they are charging at commercial rates. So while plants drink water or irrigation is at 190 paisa, when human beings drink water, it has to be pumped at 5 rupees. So that is the ridiculousness, because when a government establishes a project, they pay forever the cost of electricity and maintenance, O&M. But when the people come together and establish this, like in these 1,500 villages, 1,250 villages, well, there is a disincentive. Government doesn't pay except the capital cost of water and some of the capital cost of the sanitation system. This brings a question. When we speak about sustainability, and sustainability in rural areas cannot be achieved unless the people themselves take these into their hands, sort of taking into their hands their destinies, as far as how they go about with water, with sanitation, with education, because it starts off, once you have water, once you have sanitation, the biggest indignity that you can heap on a woman in anywhere is that she has to go and squat openly in a place. But with sanitation, you bring that down. She has privacy while bathing. She can bathe properly. Children, she can give, because she no more spends 6 hours a day bringing water. She has enough time to spend with the children and maybe doing something which would even bring an additional income. So this is our outlook, and now the government of India has accepted this as the national model, and they are funding it. So I think, however insignificant corner that we begin to work, but if the model is large enough and is robust enough to stand scrutiny and also stand the test of time, well, I think even insensitive governments will buckle and will support you.
Great. I'm wondering, Camilla and Sifo, maybe you could talk a little bit more about other examples that you've seen of what may have begun as initially kind of pilot projects or relatively small-scale projects were able to successfully scale up, and what kind of strategies?
Well, if I stay with the plumbing metaphor, we've been working now for the last 10 years with a group of urban poor federations in big cities in Africa and in Asia. And what we found is that the institutions and funding mechanisms through which people can acquire support really matter if you're going to get down to the grassroots. You can have a big irrigation system that delivers a large amount of water through big canals to a few places. Or you can have an irrigation system that thinks about delivering drop by drop by drop by drop right down to the plant level in the field. We see plumbing and the design of plumbing is key if you're going to make sure that support gets to each and every particular slum or squatter settlement where people want to make change happen. The International Poor Fund that we help support alongside Slum and Shack Dwellers International based in Cape Town seeks to get those little bits of support to support very much a bottom-up process of squatter settlement renewal, design of new water and sanitation systems they build themselves, often at 1/10 of the cost if it was done by the World Bank or some other major donor agency. So using, energizing, recognizing, and supporting the energy that poor people have themselves is key. But to do that, institutions really matter. Getting the plumbing right is key.
Sifo, did you have?
Sure.
Yeah.
I've just seen my boss, Jamie Drummond, executive director at One, and more importantly, founder of One, co-founder of One, is in the audience. We don't, as you know, do projects per se in our work as an advocacy organization. But one of the things that we've done as we scale up our own organization and moving into the African continent, so we can inform our own policies and help to also work with African civil society and other partners in terms of the work that we do and building awareness. One of the things that we've done, that we do, is we have an award. It's called the One Award, which essentially recognizes great civil society organizations and NGOs in Africa that are making incredible impact, or having incredible impact in their own communities, and in terms of reducing poverty, promoting governance, good governance and transparency and so on. And one of the projects, or some of the projects that we come across, which are quite incredible, just talking about sustainability, is both in Ghana and in Kenya. There's this widespreading sort of development of fuel-efficient stoves. They're very low cost. They target the poor. And Kenya and Ghana are actually exporting these to over 30 other countries, throughout the continent. And what they basically do is they reduce the amount of carbon, dioxide. They reduce the amount of smoke-related diseases and deaths. They reduce the use of charcoal even. And more importantly, they eliminate the chopping down of trees quite significantly. So these are really, and I could give so many examples, because just every year for the One Award, we get over 100 or 150 submissions of, these kinds of great stories. But I did want to highlight that particular issue on energy efficiency, because that's also an area that we're taking a great interest in, which is energy poverty, and how we can really help poor people to have greater access to affordable and clean energy, to how do we increase the supply of renewable sources of energy, and more importantly, how do we lobby for greater finance to enable the access of poor people to clean energy.
It is, of course, one of the goals that we hope to get out of the Rio summit in June of this year. This is the year for sustainable energy for all, announced by the United Nations, and I think we should use the Rio platform to really give it a push on that front.
Absolutely, and in fact, the new MDGs are more than likely going to be the Sustainable Development Goals. And so that's all really very pertinent to this discussion.
Well, I wonder if we could pick that up and say, so part of the issue of thinking about how to scale up projects and programs is the question of timing and seizing those opportunities that actually exist in terms of the political process, a funding process to actually seize that. So arguably, the Rio Plus, the Rio process that's happening now represents an opportunity. So I was wondering if you could each talk about what you actually see are the opportunities and challenges in that space to try and, again, either at the global level, the national level, the local level, to push this kind of agenda forward.
You'd like to start?
Sure.
Okay. I will, own up and say, you asked a question about what are our blind spots, and I think that this is an area, the whole sort of environmental discussion is one we're just beginning to explore the edges of. Certainly, in the Africa office. And so we're beginning to explore the edges of it because we understand how important it is. But I'm not going to be claimed to be an expert in that. And we're taking an increasing interest in energy poverty because it is really one of the most challenging areas of poverty, of addressing poverty reduction in Africa. So we're taking an increasing interest in it. We're learning as much as we can about it and trying to engage as much as we can. Jamie's in the audience. He'll probably make a point about it when that time comes. But it is, I would say, close to being one of our blind spots. But we recognize how important it is. And that's why we're engaging more on it, and that's why we're focusing even more on energy poverty as a means of reducing extreme poverty on the continent. And so the issues are, the whole sort of renewable energy issue. And for us, as an advocacy group, as an advocacy organization, our main focus is getting the political and the financial commitments from developed countries to be able to support, that kind of sustainable development, while at the same time also pushing the African leaders to take their responsibility and being more transparent and accountable in these critical areas. So that's what I have to say about it.
Well, we certainly see this Rio Earth Summit, 20 years on from Rio 92, as a critically important moment to get world leaders to recognize the urgent need for a change in direction. We don't see the planet in its current economic model providing long-term sustainability, either on the environmental side or on the social and development side. What we see is an economic model which is producing a lot of gains for a very small group of people, and which is impacting the livelihoods and prosperity and future of people both today and, of course, tomorrow. So I'd like to see coming out of Rio a high-level commitment, a bit like the Millennium Declaration signed in 2000 by world leaders. I'd like to see a sustainability commitment signed by world leaders that say we pledge over the next couple of years to put together, agree, and move ahead with a set of sustainable development goals that will move on from the MDGs, that will work on and build on what's been achieved through the MDGs, but add those things that are essential to try and make sure that we hand on this planet, this wonderful, extraordinary planet, in a better shape than it is today. And I think we could all come up with a range of different goals that we thought needed to be in that mix of half a dozen, 10, 12 goals. I mean, we've got one on climate already. We're not doing very well in terms of implementing that. Clearly, we need one on food security. We need one on water. We need one on oceans. We probably need them on a whole range of other things like corporate governance, like global governance, like issues of equity, and like consumption. I mean, because consumption is one of the things that tends not to get talked about enough. Current Western patterns of consumption are not feasible going forward. We need to find different ways of consuming we need to find ways of consuming less of the world's resources, where over the world's possibility of absorbing and producing at current levels of consumption, if that is going to become wider spread. So I was chatting to Achim Steiner yesterday, who runs the UN Environment Programme, who was in London for this big Planet Under Pressure conference. He's very worried that at the moment is not nearly enough political energy coming in behind the Rio summit. In Britain, we're distracted by the Diamond Jubilee of the Queen and the Olympic Games, and the Rio summit is kind of sandwiched between the two and not getting much attention. Globally, that's equally the case. There are a number of governments that are kind of raising the flag, governments of Colombia, Brazil, obviously, but Brazil could do more, Guatemala, President Hu of China is going to be at the summit, but a lot of other leaders have said, not sure I'm going to bother. So I think there's a big task for us to do, to say to our leaders, actually, this has to be a hugely important event at which you need to be present. We need you to commit to finding new ways in which we collectively can live on this planet.
And it's ironic, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it, we saw yesterday Professor Rosling's moving statistics.
Yeah.
Very soon we're approaching 10 billion people on the Earth. It's obvious that the carrying capacity, both the physical and environmental carrying capacity of the Earth, is reaching its limit. You know, so we have to change our behavior. We have to change the way we consume, like you said.
Yeah.
And it's ironic that, you know, leaders are so lukewarm about, you know, Rio.
Well, I think it's partly the dominance of the economics profession. I think it's Ken Boulding, who was an economist, who said the only person who thinks that you can have infinite growth on a finite planet are madmen or economists. And I think there is just this kind of assumption that, you know, you can just go on and on and on, and that there's no, you need to go back to the early classical economists who recognized that land and natural resources, what we think of as environment, is in fact a fixed quantity.
Joe and Vinod, did you want to enter into this?
Yeah. I would look for any multilateral government to government or a UN-headed organization coming and putting all these protocols, all these protocols, the poor person at the center. The centrality should be poverty eradication. Let us take the Kyoto Protocol, this CDM mechanism. If someone in India puts up a very poor polluting cement plant, and then goes to the CDM mechanism and says that, okay, I will clean up the whole act, that person gets a huge amount of money as carbon credits. I tried to go to the same mechanism and I said, okay, we have built over 50,000 biogas plants and biogas using animal manure for rural people. Could we aggregate this? And many of these are not now functioning because it's over 20 years old. Can we have some CDM money to see that all these are put back into action? It was not available. There was no mechanism for that. I tried the same cook stoves, efficient cook stoves. They ultimately, after a lot of argument, they said, okay, if you can do 23,500 stoves in a year, and we'll aggregate that, and of course you have this mechanism, you have the certification process, which is prohibitively expensive. Ultimately, because the burden has to be borne by the purchaser of the chula there, it all became so overwhelmingly heavy that we had to abandon that. So what I'm trying to get at is, we have to make, if there is a second Rio, this Rio conference after 20 years or another MDG, the centrality should be how this poor woman at the end of the queue can benefit. And when we have an answer, what like Gandhiji said, we have the talisman. He said, if you want to question what you are doing is right or wrong, I have a talisman for you. Look at that person or that woman at the end of the queue, at the end of the line, and your action in any way improves the life of that person, you are doing the right thing. If it makes no difference, or if it is going to make a negative impact, you are doing the wrong thing. So this is what I would like, because it's at national and international level, it's very easy to speak about poverty and all, but when it comes to the A, B, C, D persons there, how their lives, their individual lives improve, it's very difficult to change the systems and make the systems responsive to that sort of a requirement. So I hope, and I think it can be done. I am not at all pessimistic. It can be done with the right number of people gathered here or in the Skoll forum. These are people who begin, when they begin to think and when they begin to amplify that thinking, and because most of these people cannot even voice their requirement, or do not often through centuries of denial do not want to voice anymore because they are tired. If we can in some way voice or help them to voice them for themselves, but be the support that is required, I think we will make a huge, huge difference in this world, improving the planet and people.
And Vinod, if we could have your thoughts, and then I think we'll open up the conversation to everybody.
I'm also very anxious to get the good people in the room into the conversation, so I'll speak really fast. If I could just retrace back to, I think, Joe's point about, very valid point about people are willing to pay, and the multiple examples of that from microfinance, education, and so on. Add to that also one other experience of scaling up, but paying in a different way, which is government provides the programs, but they are connected to investments people actually will make, and that's the payment. And that has scaled up remarkably in Mexico and Brazil and Colombia and elsewhere, the conditional cash transfers, which get at some of the same issues, but the payment is in a very different way. And I think when you're looking for scaling up possibilities, please keep that as a real, genuine possibility in addition to the other ones that we mentioned. Just very quickly, I think the MDGs, again, from an evaluative perspective, setting targets and going after that, it has a track record of having worked. There are many things wrong with the MDGs. They don't go at the very poorest in many instances. So all of that is valid. But in just setting targets, publicly announcing it, and one study actually shows that those who wouldn't have done what MDGs requires of you in terms of maternal mortality, etc., they're the ones who did more than those who would have done it anyway. It's a counterfactual, randomized sort of experiment, which is very interesting. Lots more to be said about that. Now, going forward, and MDG 2, Rio 20 plus, all of that, the one thing that strikes me is, I think what Camilla said, 25 countries go to elections, one way, elections including in China, in one way or the other, and this issue of sustainability and inclusiveness of the growth, the two key factors that Skoll is pursuing, is not on the political agenda of any countries, whether it's the United States, France, and so on. China is the other. And the question is, why are these elections, these issues, especially climate, a vote loser, not a vote winner? And I want to connect this to the growth issue. Everyone, rightly, is interested in jobs and higher incomes. But what kind of incomes? Everyone is therefore interested in growth, but what kind of growth? If we can find, if not win-win, but different paths of growth that focus on the quality of growth and not the pace of growth, that could turn it around to a point of saying you just cannot grow anymore without it being sustainable. You cannot grow anymore in the right way, let's say, without including more people. The arithmetic and the science are just against you. And if that at the public consciousness level, the political, the finance ministers, etc., and the vote-getting policy level, and crucially, the business and the economic community who, as the madmen, have gotten it wrong, either in the good, generous interpretation in the sense of neglecting it, in the less generous interpretation in the vested interest side. That has to change if this is going to become even a mini vote supporter. Without that, I think the discussion will go and it'll be too late. In the end, things will settle. The world will go to a low-carbon path out of necessity. The only question is how you go there. You can go in a disastrous way or you can go in a more organized way.
Great. So maybe we can open up and maybe we'll take 2 or 3 comments that are in a row and then have the response. So right here.
Well, I just love the conversation, especially since
And perhaps you could just introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. I'm Susan Burns with Global Footprint Network. And we're kind of obsessed with this topic of this double bottom line, how you provide human development benefits within the capacity of the planet. And I loved what Vinod said about needing both. You need sort of the big picture, the elephant in the room, are we sending the right policy signals, and then the examples on the ground that should be, encouraged. But I think my question for Vinod is, how do we get these really strong signals to be sent from development agencies, from foundations, that we require this double bottom line? We can't be successful in Africa or anywhere else if natural capital isn't preserved. Then we're not sending the right signals to government or anybody. So I'm just wondering, because it seems like a kind of this groupthink, as somebody said. This is the way development needs to be done, and how do you change that?
If you could turn around and hand the microphone to the gentleman right behind you, that would be great.
David Wilcox, Reach Scale. I just returned from the Marseille Water Conference. There were 17,000 people there trying to figure out the water problem. So a couple of issues. One is we continue in a donor-driven model with 15 to 20% of the money spent on measurement to justify the money. And we continue to pursue things that therefore can't scale because you just can't be profitable doing that. So I'm curious, particularly from Joe and the work he's done, how they've been able to lower the cost of doing their projects so they can do twice as many projects with the same amount of money, which is kind of what we need to accomplish somehow here. And I think social enterprise is an engine for doing that. And then I'm curious from the folks who I would characterize might not be real social entrepreneurs on the panel, how familiar they are with actual social enterprises who are 2xing these impacts, and how active they are in substituting those models for the models they've historically used, which are more donor-driven.
Great. That's a healthy amount of stuff, I think, to engage. So why don't we start with that? And I don't know, why don't we start, Vinod, with you, and then we'll work our way down the...
Okay. On Susan's question, I think I do believe that unless you do top-down and bottom-up, it's not going to be sufficient. There is a dish in the Philippines. It's called bibingka. The heat has to come from the top and the bottom for it to cook in a holistic way. How do we do that? I think the signal from agencies such as the World Bank, ADB, and so on, I do think that indicators and presentation that really capture the attention of leadership as well as working people is really critical. And that you can cite examples of where that has what is not measured just doesn't get the attention. So that, that sounds a mechanical solution, but it really, really matters, where the profit motive is not the only thing driving it. It is a conviction that the social benefits and costs are a different calculus from the private, and so the indicators could lay that out. Now, a couple of intermediary things, though. When it comes to sustainability issues and inclusive growth issues, the conviction that this is in the country's national interest, it's not out there for somebody in the global setting, that is critical, and that could change minds. Number two, that it's about today, and don't bring in the discount rates and think about this as the 25-year problem, but it's today, and that gets the political side a little bit more aligned. It won't be perfect, but it will be in the right direction. And third, repeating what I said, unless you're connected to jobs and incomes and somehow growth, but shifting to the quality of growth and not the pace of growth, and if the finance ministries kind of see, because right now you have a two-track thing, all this nice stuff going on, but in the end, countries are ranked by income, growth, and that gets money, and that gets investments. Asia is a fantastic case in point, the most successful region in the world, and the money is flowing very well based on whose growth rate is, pace of growth is going up faster. So I think that is an issue, and you just have to work on at least these three fronts to bring them together. I'll come back to David's great question after the other panelists, if necessary.
Great. Sifo, did you want to?
Well,
I think the question,
the question to me, what we have done is mostly, first of all, accessing funds. We firmly believe that, first and foremost, government funds are almost the only funds where we have a right to get. And we make every effort to get the allocation in the budget to be used for that purpose. Because we in India are now also planning to send a person to the moon, so whatever they can save, it will be for that trip to the moon. So the allocations should be spent for that. But for that, there is leveraging that is required. Foundations like the Skoll Foundation and other organizations, I mean, we use funds that are available from them. It's about 20% of the funds if we can get. We can leverage that huge ball. I mean, only depends how long is the lever. So leveraging is something which is very important, and the cost cutting down is when people do everything themselves. They contribute their labor, they become even the skilled labor like masons, plumbers, and they build the toilet, the showers, they build the waterworks. So it is, I mean, compared to the government of India or government of Orissa, yes, it's our better things, that it is better water supply and sanitation that we build, but it's at less than 25% of the cost, because most of the costs are taken care by people themselves who do not ask for any payment because they're doing their work, and it is all sustained by them.
Sure.
One of the things that I wanted to say, about just measurements and matrices and all of that, is that I think it's really important, like Vinod pointed out. But on the other hand, also, isn't it really just about who makes decisions? Isn't it about politics and power? And I suspect that's why we're an advocacy organization rather than a think tank. We work very well with think tanks. But it's also about the politics, and the people who make these decisions and going after them and just appealing to their consciences and to the reality of things, because I think we understand, the mathematics behind it, the calculations, the matrix, the data, and all of that. But at the end of the day, it's about politics and power and the people who make these decisions. So I wanted also just to make that point.
Can I just come to Susan's question about where important points of leverage might be for foundation funding. I mean, I think we all live in a sort of slightly idealized world where, you know, we know we've got to have high-level political commitment at the top and lots of grassroots stuff going on from below, and somehow we'll all kind of move together in a seamless, positive way. I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves that actually the world that we live in is very much a second-best one in terms of the way in which things work, and assuming you know, the best is often the enemy of the good. What I think is really important coming out of Rio is that you've got a smallish number of countries who say, we don't care what you guys want to do. We want to move towards a more sustainable pathway. We want to construct a low emissions growth pattern, and we're going to go there, you know, you know, it's unfortunate that we share the same planet, but we want to move ahead. And I can see a whole number of countries who want to go down that track, and ways to provide support to these groupings of often the most climate vulnerable countries, often countries whose carbon footprint, you know, is teensy like that, but who recognize that we've got a collective problem and everybody needs to do their bit. And being in the vanguard of that movement is going to be better not only for the planet, but also for them as economies, generating new ways of doing things at lower cost.
So Leninist social enterprise, right? That's an advocacy movements, right? Bring back the vanguard. That's Vinod, did you want to?
Well, I thought the question on whether these models have been taken on board by multilaterals and so on, just a passing reference. There are pieces of that have been, but if you think of this as a way of doing business, that inclusiveness and sustainability drive the agenda, no, because in the end, either the excuse or the genuine part of this is that countries demand the kind of projects they want. So I have to say, putting the money out the door is the primary goal, unfortunately. And so that is the gap that there is that needs to be addressed. And lots of comments have been made on how to get there, aside from indicators, getting at the motivation for why that is the case is probably the most fundamental thing.
Right here. I think you could hold on for 1 sec. I think they're going to give you a mic so that the recording can hear your question.
Hi, my name is Barry Childs. I represent an organization called Africa Bridge. And our focus is on improving the lives of the most vulnerable children in village communities. And I really just wanted to emphasize the whole point that's come out around grassroots and involving the people at the grassroots level and what we've learned from them. So, and when I say grassroots, our organization is about children. So we involve children in strategic village children in a 3-day strategic planning conference on what should be done in that community. And when I first started this, people said, "You're nuts. I mean, what can children do in a strategic planning meeting?" The remarkable thing is that children know so much about what's going on in their community, but beyond their community, and what needs to be done. And so everything we do and have done has actually come out of the mouths of children as intervention, as a complex, holistic intervention in these villages. When we have the children meet with the village leaders and stakeholders, it means that the context of what is done is from the children's perspective. So, for example, I mean, the children, first thing they want to do is go to school. So there's a lot of discussion about going to school. But they get into the village economy. And for example, children have said, well, what needs to happen to improve the village economy is for our guardians, many of them are orphans, these are villages with very high rates of orphans, our guardians and our parents need to be educated on agriculture and how to improve the agriculture. And then when we get the children and the adults together, you know, the adults agree with that totally, but then they add the fact that they need capital. They've got an asset, which is land, and they need capital. So, for example, one of the things we've done is done precisely that, given the guardians of these children, form them into economic co-ops, and then help fund banks for them, and they run their own banks. And I mean, this means that in a village where only 50% of the children are in school, after 5 years, 100% in school. They go from eating 1 meal a day to 5 meals a day, eating meat 3 times a year to 3 times a week. So just that bottom up, I think, is so critical in terms of accountability, transparency, and it impacts all the things that we're talking about, I think, that go up to a government level.
Neil, over in the up on the top here. And did you also have your hand up in the corner? Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Lori Marker, and I'm from the Cheetah Conservation Fund. I'm based in Namibia, Africa, and I work with people throughout sub-Saharan Africa on lands where there's a lot of livestock. And so predator issues really revolve around human, I guess, food security. And so I really want to add on to the comments that you made over there. We've developed a program which is called Future Farmers of Africa. So building off of a program in America called Future Farmers of America, it really teaches young people and older people how to farm. And one of the things that we've seen throughout all of the areas that we work with throughout Cheetah Range countries is that the rural farmers don't know how to take care of their livestock. So they lose them to predators, but then it's not just predators. They lose them to starvation, to lack of being able to care for them, lack of knowing what kind of medical needs those animals have. And so the basic needs of education are really, really critical. And when we see then young people who go through college in agriculture training, they often leave, they get into agriculture extension offices, and then they really aren't back onto the villages. So there's a huge amount of need for getting onto those lands with the people, teaching very basic skills, skills that then can transfer from young people into the villages to feed themselves. And from that, we think that cooperatives are extremely important. And people don't know how to actually develop cooperatives throughout many of the areas. And so really kind of pulling communities together are extremely important, which will then look at food security. But the basic education has to really look at the basic needs around technical problems, and not just everyone being the doctor, the lawyer, the nurse, but we're really looking at food security as we look at the growth of Africa that we learned more about today. So I'd like to talk more about these issues around something called Future Farmers of Africa, because if we don't feed Africa, we're going to all have lots of problems worldwide, but it's not only going to affect the economy and the people living in Africa, it's going to affect the nature as well. And so as an environmentalist, I look at how it's all tied in together. And in order to, for me, save the cheetah, I have to see Africa an entirely different place. And we need lots and lots and lots of help throughout all of sub-Saharan Africa. There is not very much water, and we have to really address those needs as we look at the livestock issues. Thank you.
Great. So Sifo and Camilla, I know that both of you are kind of intimately embedded in the broader debates on food security in sub-Saharan Africa, in your case, and more broadly, also in Camilla's case. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the particular conjunction of issues around the kind of the broader food security debate in terms of both concerns about increasing production and focus on smallholders, but also addressing that in the context of both climate change, water scarcity.
I mean, these issues are all really very tied up. I talked earlier about our campaign in Africa, and we recently, gave a petition, handed a petition to President Kikwete and the African leaders, asking them first to meet their commitments and invest in agriculture, and rural development, and to do so in a way that is transparent and that ensures that smallholders are really benefiting. So what is it? We're focusing really on the quality issues around that, and part of what really spurred us on this campaign was the famine in the Horn of Africa. And part of our byline in that whole campaign was make this the last famine. There is no need to have that kind of a situation in Africa, but it will take concerted investments. It will take concerted efforts in just investing in the right things, in the markets, the infrastructure, the extension services, and ensuring that there is ultimately food security on the continent, and doing it also in a responsible way that doesn't tax the environment, So people need to learn about new methods of agriculture, drip irrigation, and those kinds of things that are more efficient ways of handling the environment and the earth and so on. And then, of course, there's the political issues around it, like the land grab issues, and so on. That's another level of discussion also. But it impacts, the people and how much they want to invest. Then there's the issues also of land tenure rights or property rights and so on. That also, again, affects the extent to which people are willing to invest. And so it's a really huge debate, this whole discussion of food security, investing in agriculture. It really touches on a lot of key issues. But I think what will be important in order to be able to produce enough food so that, there is food security, you need to be able to balance that by doing it in a way that is sustainable, because that's really the key to it. As I said, we're moving to 10 billion in the next generation, and the carrying capacity of this earth is limited. Essentially, that's the only way to put it. And so, how do we get more by using less, in a way?
I was chatting to a shepherd last weekend in the Pyrenees, and he was complaining to me about the fact that they've recently introduced bears. Bears kill sheep. And so you've got a very similar issue around how do you balance up the need to conserve and re-establish some of these large mammals within big ecosystems with the fact that there are also other interests there. My only comment would be you need to try and find that balance right. You need to find a way in which you can work both with the environmental interests supporting the predators and with the local shepherds, because local shepherds or local cattle keepers, they've got rights to use that land. Finding ways in which they can get something out of that management of cheetahs or of bears is a critical part. I think Sifa has responded very much as I would on the food security side. I think it is a question really of firming up government commitments to agriculture and supporting farmers to hold on to, have rights to, the land on which this agriculture is going to be done. Because if that land is taken away from them, then I think that's never going to help smallholders find a prosperous future.
Great. If we can have these two, and if we can ask people, one of the other resource constraints we have is time. And so if people could focus on specifically the questions they have rather than the broader contextual framing remarks, that would be helpful.
Okay, Tim Smith from the Eden Project in Cornwall. I just wanted to lower the tone dramatically. My experience of working in a country which I shall not name is dealing with many of the big guys from the UN, whatever. I have never met such a bunch of incompetent, undirected people in my life.
This is lowering the tone, you
yeah,
said, right?
Yeah,
I just wanted to be clear. No, I'm just kidding.
I want to say that because when you look at what Joe's talking about, people doing it on the ground, if you have people on the ground who are being told something is urgent and they're dealing with civil services who are more interested in their own jobs than actually delivering the money on the ground, you create a complete disconnect in terms of the narrative as to whether what's being tried is important. And I wondered what your views might be about that.
Great. And if we could have over here. Oh, there's somebody else over here. If they could pass the mic, that would be great.
My name's Ilana. Simon and I facilitate virtual global collaborations for change, people and planet. I had a question and an offering. How do we go to the Skoll.org site to join you in that petition that you mentioned at the top of the hour, just to be very pragmatic?
www.one.org.
Okay. So perhaps this group can catalyze, at least read and decide if we support and catalyze that. The second is there have been myriad global issues you all have addressed, and the invitation is for anyone who wants to continue any thread of this conversation. RiseBeyond.org is an environment where facilitated virtual discussions specifically focused on tangible outcomes is what we do. So just, if you'd like a card, please stop by, because we've tried to cover so much in an hour and a half. Love to invite a deeper discussion. So thank you all.
Great. Is there maybe space for one more question that we could capture right up here in the front?
Thank you. My name is Martin Hildebrandt. Sorry. I work in Colombia in the Amazon rainforest with indigenous people. I just want to bring up one question. We are talking here that the model we have, we cannot continue reproducing this model. We have to change it. And at the same time, we're talking that it's very important that the children go to school. And that I have a problem there. I'm not saying in all communities, but many times going to school is putting the children to reproduce the same model, because they're going to learn about the same model. And sometimes what we're doing is that we're taking them out of, instead of empowering the local people, instead of showing and letting them analyze the situation, looking at their own traditional knowledge, look how they understand things, and bringing elements from our culture, not solutions, not answers, just elements for them to analyze and think. Perhaps they can, more than schooling, it's more learning, that the children can learn and they can start producing something new, something that's more adapted to their reality. Because schooling sometimes takes the children out of the community, takes them into the city, greater poverty, and the community is left without essential people in the community, and the whole community has its own institutions and its own way of dealing with life, with all the difficulties it has. And I'm not saying we shouldn't bring in technology and all these elements you're talking about, but I do see that we have a certain problem that I hear many people speaking like this morning, schooling, and I don't know if that really is that simple. I think there is something to look into there.
Great. So, yep, go ahead.
Well, I'll pick up on Tim's lowering the tone. Tim, I have a lot of sympathy for what you say, but I think we have to kind of get away from these categories. My feeling is that there are three different kinds of people. There's progressives, there's blockers, and then there's a huge inert middle. And I think you find that mix of people in every sort of organization. I know some fabulous people in the UN system, and I know a huge wodge of inert fellows and some blockers. And I'd say exactly the same for NGOs. I'd say exactly the same for people in business. I'd say exactly the same for people in government. We somehow have to manage the people who think progressively and who want to get positive change, to find a way in which we can connect across those categories, try to kick the blockers, non-violence, try and find ways of getting the blockers out of our way and try to capture the energy of those inert masses to move in our direction.
Other folks responding? I think there's the question on schooling and
education.
Well, I am an African woman. I probably should not get into the discussion about schooling because I will really just get carried away with it. So I'll let other people respond to it.
I mean, just on the education point, there's a part I agree and a part I disagree. The part I agree is that in getting kids to school, access to education is the part of the Millennium Development Goal that got attention. And we have a lot of evaluative material showing that getting schools to kids is maybe a necessary condition for a number of things. But the learning outcomes is really what matters, and they seem to have gone in two different directions in a lot of cases, and this has not been taken up. So what is the goal that a small organization or a big one has in mind? Is it quantity, number of kids in school, or is the learning outcome? And I would say that on the latter, the record is not good, and that needs to change. And that's a big piece of what people have been saying. On the other side, keep them where they are because there are benefits to them. I think you have to look at it a little bit more broadly, and I'm sure you have, but provided the learning and the curriculum and all of that is broad enough to open minds of kids, I would be very strongly in favor of getting them into schools and not keeping them where they are. But that's a difference. Finally, we got a difference of view.
Great. Joe?
I think the important thing to get people, children of even minority communities to school is to give them the tool so that they can handle the system, so that they have the education that the others are having, and by which the others superimpose themselves on these people. So if my indigenous people with whom I work, now every engineer, every administrator, every doctor, every physician, everyone is from outside, in no way owning up the system, or in no way having even an empathy for those people. If through the same system, if these people, these children could come up, and let us not forget, they have also their own ingenuity. So they will come up, they will be able to face the system that is there, the Indian system or the Orissa system, and there is, at present there are no other tools to really confront and fight that. Second, I think we also should not, today we are what we are because of the same traditional education that we have gone through, but maybe we have challenged it here and there. When I was studying in school, there was a tribe in the northeast of India there is a tribe called the Nagas. They came to these boarding schools. I was in a boarding school. They didn't want even to go back. But it was only for a very short while. They got the education that I got and others got. They realized how great was their culture. Then they went back. And today, the Mizos and the Nagas, the Mizos fought a pitched battle with the Indian army. Today, it's another, they wanted statehood. It was given. Nagas are fighting. Yeah, they have not yet won, but nor has the Indian government won. There is a real assertion of their culture and their identity, which could not have been done in any protective way, but by their exposure, they realize how great is their culture, how to fight the Indian government, how to fight the system of which almost by which we were colonizing them. And today, they are where they are. So,
great. So we are running out of time. I wondered if we could give our panelists, and again, recognizing resource constraints, the two-sentence message that you would hope that perhaps people would be walking away from this. And then we're going to close up. Yeah.
Okay, well, if I start at this end of the line, I'm going to take home Joe's metaphor for what you need to test things by. If it doesn't work for the woman at the end of the line, then think again.
My hero is Mahatma Gandhi, and I'd like to, in this, because we are speaking about planet, give another sentence, another quote from him. There is enough in this world for our need, but there isn't enough for our greed.
What does that mean?
I think really having this discussion for me, I've taken a lot from everything from everyone I've heard from here. But what I would like others to probably take home with them is the importance of transparency and accountability. And like I said, the only reason we're interested in it is because ultimately that's what will deliver health, schools, roads, poverty reduction, and will make development more effective and more accountable. So,
great.
Since I have to go immediately after this, I want to thank John and the great panel and the wonderful people here for this great session. Maybe with reference to Rio Plus 20, just in case that could make a difference. On the inclusive growth side, I like to go back to something President Lula, when he took office, said, and I was in a meeting in that occasion as country director for Brazil, and he said, why is it that when we build a dam worth $500 million, it's called an investment, and when we invest in children or the health of the mom, that is called a current expenditure, so it is something you can do or not. Then on sustainable development, the twin plank of this, I'll just continue the tradition of quoting Mahatma Gandhi. I think he also said, you can do what you want with nature, but remember, at the end of the day, what's on the asset side of your ledger will equal what's on your liability side of the ledger.
Great. If everyone could join me in thanking not only our panelists, but Kristen Gillis and Joy Zhang from the Skoll Foundation, who in many ways are really the secrets behind the success of this panel as it exists. And if we're all going to be quoting Gandhi, then I guess it's, be the change that you want to see in the world. And thanks very much.